been doing this investigation now for 5 weeks. We haven't been sitting here doing nothing. We've been putting in a lot of hours.
This was a very brutal killing. The victim was pregnant. This was angry, and this was vicious.
Your husband is in jail for murder, and you're drug into that mess.
When you've got such an overkill on somebody, it suggests that it's personal.
Were you 100% involved in this? Were you standing there when she was killed?
We confronted her with some of the evidence, tried to get her to tell us more of what she knew, and she just accused us of making that up and lying about that information.
I want to see her dead body. I want to see exactly
She's in a grave. She's been buried. She's been laid to rest.
Well, I want to see a picture. You have this evidence. What evidence?
Scientific evidence. And when I say that, that means DNA. You can't mess with DNA. You can't change it. You can't take it away.
We knew it all to be lies.
He did something horrible, and you know it.
You're trying to rattle my bones.
Okay.
She had no problem participating in the planning of this murder. In fact, she enjoyed it.
Love can make people do all sorts of crazy things. People kill for love.
November 13th, 2015. Minot, North Dakota. It's just after 7 a.m. when a local resident dials 911 in a panic.
911, what's the address for emergency? I just got home, my back door is kicked in, and my girl ain't answering the phone.
The Minot Police Department received a 911 call from Christopher Jackson. He was reporting that his fiancée, Angela Wilder, was not responding to his calls. He had arrived home from work and found that their back door had been kicked open.
He called into the house for his fiancée and his 2-year-old son, and he has not received any response.
I'm about to go in. Okay, why don't you just wait for officers? I'll get them over there. All right, thank you.
Minot officers arrive within minutes and are met by 32-year-old Christopher Jackson.
He became somewhat disorderly because he wanted to go in and see what was going on, and they had to physically restrain him from doing that. First responders went inside to check the residence, to clear the residence.
It's clean, it's orderly, it's tastefully decorated, and they notice all these pictures on the walls in the living room of Angela and her kids, and they think this house was cozy. This house had a family. And so then they walk down the hallway, and one of the officers calls her name multiple times, and she does not respond whatsoever. And so they know that this situation is dire.
They found the 19-month-old baby boy awake in his crib, and then across from his bedroom, they found Wilder's and Jackson's bedroom locked. First responders took the baby out to Mr. Jackson and asked for permission to force entry into that bedroom. Mr. Jackson did give them permission to do that.
2 other officers kicked down the door. There was just barely any light, and so it was very dark. So they flipped on the light. They noticed that there were bloodstains on the sheets, but there was nobody in the bed. They walked even further into the room, and that's when they discovered Angela's body laying on the ground in a pool of blood.
There were several visible stab wounds. They were all up around her neck and her upper chest area. It was very obvious that Angela Wilder was targeted in this murder.
It was school time. And with the school being right across the street, I'm ushering the kids across the street to school. And as I'm walking back, they're putting police tape up. I looked at the officer and I pointed at the house and I said, "What is going on? I have friends in there." And that's when he just said, there's nothing I can say. I had no idea what was going on. I just knew that it wasn't okay. Angela, she was very sweet. I just remember being very concerned.
Originally from California, Angela Small had spent the majority of her young life in Phoenix City, Alabama.
I grew up in the same church as Angela. She was really sweet, like timid around people she didn't know, but very extroverted around people that she was familiar with. And so I think she thrived around people that she knew and loved.
Angela was very heavily involved in her church. She attended all of the group activities, all the youth activities. She completed her seminary work. She was very devout to the Mormon faith.
After high school, Angela moved 250 miles away to attend the University of South Alabama on a full Army scholarship. But her path dramatically shifted during her first semester.
She meets somebody, and they begin dating. But then all of a sudden, Angela finds out that she's pregnant. She decided she was going to keep the baby. The Army really wanted scholars to focus on their studies, and so she did have to drop out.
The relationship with her child's father was short-lived. So Angela moved back home to Phoenix City and reconnected with her church.
A man named Richie Wilder was attending that church as well, and he was a growing leader. She really liked him. He had a job, he had goals for his future. Angela and Richie start dating.
Richie was very charismatic, outgoing, very cute and charming, and he fell head over heels in love with her daughter, and he was around them all the time. They got married in January of 2009. They were really excited to see what their future was going to hold, and Richie was really excited to be able to adopt Angela's daughter.
Shortly after getting married, Richie joined the Air Force.
Angela was a little reserved about him going into the military, but they kind of wanted some financial stability, and so that was Richie's way of providing for Angela and her daughter.
They are assigned to the Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. And they find out very quickly afterwards that Angela is pregnant with their second child.
After the birth of their son, however, Angela and Richie began to disagree about how best to raise their children.
They had kind of isolated themselves up there in the north, and they're experiencing what married life really feels like, and it's hard for them.
And pretty soon things kind of became rocky. And the marriage really probably wasn't meant to be to begin with.
The couple decided to divorce in the spring of 2012 and concentrated on co-parenting.
The custody arrangement was pretty fair. It was 1 week on, 1 week off. Shortly after their divorce, Angela went back to Alabama to visit some of her friends and family, and a man named Christopher Jackson. Christopher and Angela were high school sweethearts. A few weeks after she returns home from that trip, she discovers that she is pregnant with Christopher's baby.
He ended up coming up to Minot to be with her, and eventually they were engaged.
Angela and Chris, they weren't lovey-dovey, like hanging all over each other, that sort of thing, but you could see an admiration that they had for one another. Angela liked school. She had drive. She talked about how much she liked to help people, so being a nurse made sense for a field for her.
Angela enrolls in nursing school. Christopher gets a job at Walmart working overnights, and the two are really trying to make a life together.
28-year-old Angela gave birth to her third child in 2013. And in October 2015, she learned she was pregnant with her fourth.
She was happy. She seemed happy.
But just 2 months into her pregnancy, authorities have been called to Angela and Christopher's home, where Angela has been found stabbed to death with their 19-month-old son in the next room.
I met with patrol officers. They kind of updated me what they had found and what they've seen.
One of the things that the police officers discussed was they could not figure out why Christopher did not go into the house. Christopher instead had dialed 911. It served as a giant red flag to the other officers because if their wife or their children were in peril of any kind, they would have immediately gone into the house, no questions asked.
So we were keeping an eye on him and trying to work with him to get him to come down to the police department.
I saw Chris just for a split second being put into a squad car. It was so sad to see the people that you care about in that sort of situation, and there's nothing you can do.
Coming up, detectives learn about an enemy in Angela's life.
But he's alone with my problem. Isn't through it. He doesn't like her, she doesn't like him.
And a new romance will be tested when it becomes the focus of the investigation.
I trust my husband.
Let me tell you something.
100%.
Well, then you're wrong.
I don't think that apart they would have carried out this vicious murder, but I think that they fed off of each other quite well.
On the morning of November 13th, 2015, Minot police begin processing the home of 30-year-old Angela Wilder after she was discovered stabbed to death inside her bedroom.
Typical for us on our crime scene unit is we wait until the investigators determine what's going to be needed as far as processing of the crime scene. When we arrive on scene, we'll do a walkthrough. So Angela's body was in full rigor mortis. It was cold. She definitely had been deceased for several hours. She had an extensive amount of stab wounds, all concentrated around her neck and her upper torso, her shoulders.
You could tell that she was either pulled from the bed or slid out of the bed from the blood around Miss Wilder. You could tell just from the scene that there was a little bit of a struggle.
Angela, she had defensive wounds. She had some broken fingernails and some wounds to her hands.
So we asked that her fingernails be clipped for possible DNA evidence.
She was wearing just underwear and a shirt. We could see on her underwear the outline of what looked like a knife blade in blood. It looked like whoever had done this had possibly wiped or laid the weapon down on her.
We had the perfect knife print on her underwear, but there was no murder weapon found at the scene.
Detectives move on from the bedroom and determine that forced entry was made through the rear door of the home.
It looked like some damage to the back door, but there was nothing really obvious that made it appear as if someone had broken in to steal anything or ransack the home.
Authorities finish processing the scene and transport the victim's body to the medical examiner's office.
During the autopsy of Angela Wilder, we learned that she was stabbed nearly 40 times. When you've got such an overkill on somebody, it suggests that it's personal. We knew that we're going to have to start interviewing people within the victim's circle. I called the social services and I told them we had a 19-month-old that kind of needed to be cared for while we dealt with his father. We were questioning the fact that Chris Jackson did not go into the home. Everybody said, oh, if that was me, I would rush right in to see what happens.
At the station, detectives sit down with Angela's fiancé, Christopher Jackson, and ask him to walk them through the events of the previous evening.
Christopher Jackson's story was that he was dropped off at work at 10 p.m. on Thursday, the 12th of November, and that he worked the overnight shift at Walmart.
At midnight, his first break, he called Angela. And they talked for a little bit. His second break, around 2 a.m., he calls her again, and everything's fine.
But then there became a point where she she quit answering his calls.
She always picks up whenever I call her. I said, okay, she's just tired. Shot her a text message, said, I love you, told her what was going on with the work and everything. 7 o'clock or 6:50 gets here, and I go to clock out, and I go walking out to the lot, because usually she's out there. And she's not out there this morning. So I called her to see where she was at. And I keep calling her. And she's not picking up the phone. So I call a taxi, because I figure she's just that tired.
When Christopher Jackson arrived back home, the rear door was kicked open.
Immediately I thought something was wrong. Her car is still here. She didn't leave. She would have answered the phone.
Did you go into the house?
Something in my stomach said not clear.
So you never went in the house?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Even though your child's in there and your wife is in there?
I know it seems hard to understand.
I felt like he was scared to go in until somebody's in that situation and worried about what they're going to find. I don't think people really know how they're going to react. Everything that Mr. Jackson was telling the detectives seemed to be legitimate. He seemed to be being honest, but we couldn't just take his word for it. We would have to cooperate with Walmart and just make sure that he's not in any way involved in this murder.
Detectives ask if they can take samples of his DNA for comparison. He quickly complies.
Then the detectives give him a little break for a little bit. And in that break, the camera is still rolling in the interview room. And it catches Christopher calling Angela's sister.
They find Richie Walder.
At this point, we needed more information on what he knew about Richie's involvement in this murder.
In Minot, North Dakota, the fiancée of murder victim Angela Wilder has just called out Angela's ex-husband as a person of interest, and detectives need to know why. They return to the interrogation room and press Christopher Jackson for more details.
What's her relationship like with Richie?
If you can name it, they've probably been through it. He doesn't like her, she doesn't like him.
According to Christopher, Angela confided in him that her marriage to Richie ended under volatile circumstances.
He was beating the out of her and he got divorced over it.
Christopher claims the conflict continued even after their divorce.
There was constant fighting over the custody of the kids, to the point where Angela and Richie couldn't even do the weekly exchange.
Angela was having like anxiety attacks and just panicking and stuff after seeing him, so instead of her taking and dropping off the kids and everything, I always went, so I'd walk the kids in so she never had to see him or anything.
Detectives knew that they would have to verify Christopher's alibi, and now it was time to talk to Richie Wilder.
Detectives end their interview with Christopher, and a few hours later bring Richie in for questioning.
Hello, hi, are you Richie?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Richie. My name is Detective Krista. My nice Sergeant Detective Dave Goodman.
We're doing an investigation here, and obviously this is serious. And I'll tell you, Angela's dead.
All right.
He made the comment very nonchalantly, oh really? And didn't seem to be too concerned about that at all. I'll tell you what, there's a lot of fingers pointing right at you.
Well, yeah. Because I'm her ex-husband, right?
Well, you're her ex-husband, and you guys have a volatile relationship.
Your history.
You don't know your history.
Richie denies abusing Angela and instead makes his own shocking accusation.
Richie claims that Angela started abusing their older daughter.
She abused twice. I reported her both times. At the same time, I ended up filing for divorce.
Richie claims he would never hurt his ex-wife, but detectives are skeptical.
How can you prove to me that I'm looking at the wrong person?
Well, I don't know when this happened, but I know yesterday I was with my kids, and Cindy came home, and we had dinner, and I went to work, and I came home, and I slept.
Richie explains that Cynthia Wilder, or Cindy to her friends and family, is his current wife. They had met in 2012 while working part-time at the Minot Vocational Center.
Richie is quirky and funny, and Cynthia right away is just really taken by this guy and really enjoys his personality. She actually went through the employee directory and found Richie's number and texted him and asked him if he was available for a date that night. Within a few months, they're living together.
Richie seemed nice and cordial, and she was happy and doing good, and it seemed like life was really good for her.
And by April, Cynthia was pregnant.
The couple married in August 2013.
After Cindy has their daughter, she graduates from Minot State University with a degree in teaching. It wasn't long before she was offered a position to have her own kindergarten room.
She loved teaching and loved having all the kids and all the different things she was doing. And so, yeah, it seemed like life was really good for her, and I was happy about that.
Richie Wilder said that his wife was in bed, Cindy Wilder was in bed, and that she could verify that he was at home all night. I had noticed while we were sitting there talking with Richie that he had a scratch on his cheek, and it was clear at the autopsy that Angela Wilder had fought back. What happened to your face?
Right
You
here.
had a scratch in your
Yeah,
face.
that's right. We play wrestle/play fight.
Richie complies with detectives' request to photograph the scratch and collect his DNA.
We ended up getting search warrants for Richie's car as well as Cindy Wilder's Honda Pilot. And after that, he was free to leave for the time being.
Following his release, detectives head to the elementary school where Cindy Wilder works to corroborate Richie's alibi.
We're investigating something that has to do with Richie's ex-wife, Angela.
She's dead, and we need to get to the bottom of it. Telling her the information about Angela, she also didn't seem to be overly concerned about that news.
The detectives asked Cynthia to confirm Richie's alibi, and Cynthia repeats it almost verbatim.
He got home like 11:30, 11:45. Were you awake when he got home? I was in bed, but I was still awake, yes.
She said she woke up several times throughout the night to check on their children.
Where was he at when you got up? He was in bed all 3 times you woke up? Okay.
Detectives wrap up Cindy's interview and proceed with the warrant to search her car.
On the passenger door, as I was photographing, I noticed what looked like just a small stain on the inside of the door panel. We took a swab of that sample.
Detectives then execute the search warrant on the couple's apartment and Richie's car.
We did that search and did not locate anything of any evidentiary value that would help us in this murder investigation.
With their suspicions growing against Richie and Cindy, detectives speak to Angela's friends and family about her relationship with her ex-husband.
Richie did make accusations that Angela had been abusing their kids. I personally do not think that was even possible. I never saw that side of her.
Angela Wilder's mother and her sister said that he was lying and that there's no way that it had gone down the way that he had said. They both indicated that Richie Wilder had a very volatile relationship with Angela. They said that Richie had choked her while they were in base housing. So he was eventually court-martialed for that and was given a dishonorable discharge from the military. It was brought up several times by family that Richie's the one that's responsible. Richie's the one that we need to be looking at.
The main working theory was he planned to just remove her from the picture because then he wouldn't have to worry about any issues with custody.
He's got the strongest motive that we have heard so far, but we just don't have the proof.
Detectives received the DNA results from the crime lab nearly a month later.
The blood swab that was collected from the front door of Cindy's Honda Pilot came back to be Angela Wilder's blood. So we knew at that point Cindy had some involvement. The analysis of the fingernail clippings showed that there was DNA under Angela's fingernails. DNA that could be matched to Richie Wilder.
Nearly 1 month into the murder investigation of Angela Wilder, detectives have uncovered evidence that her ex-husband, Richie Wilder, is likely responsible.
The DNA that was found underneath Angela's fingernails was in fact Richie's DNA.
That seemed to match the scratch that Richie had on his face.
Richie's current wife, Cindy, is also under suspicion after Angela's blood was found in her vehicle. But detectives need more proof in order to arrest her.
We felt like we had enough to start on the arrest warrant for Richie Wilder.
On December 18th, detectives receive their warrant and locate Richie at a local gym.
We were dressed with police vests and had some members of the SWAT team with us.
Richie immediately requests a lawyer.
He has no interest in talking whatsoever, so they go ahead and book him and put him into the Ward County Jail.
That afternoon, detectives bring Cindy in for further questioning.
The detectives tell her that her husband has been arrested for murder, and she says there's no way, and she proceeds to be just defiant.
You're trying to rattle my bones.
Okay, Cindy, we wouldn't do this if we didn't have proof. Which blood do you think is in there?
I don't know.
I'll tell you, Angela's blood.
Where was it?
It was in the Honda.
He didn't leave the house that night.
Yes, he did.
He didn't leave the house that night.
No, he didn't. I was up several times with the kids and he was out cold.
That's not true.
That's not true.
Cindy Wilder stuck to her story. She just would not talk to us about anything incriminating involving Richie Wilder or herself. We still were very suspicious of Cindy Wilder, but we also knew that there's probably no way that we would ever prove this. We had no reason to hold her, and she was released and allowed to go about her day.
As news of Richie's arrest spreads, friends and family are shocked.
We see his mugshot pop up on our Facebook feed, and rumor mills start going around like crazy. Everyone is thinking, how is he being tied to this murder? Like, what are the circumstances?
As soon as I found out, I had called Cindy and asked her, what's going on, and she obviously was very distraught and upset and said, I don't know, but they're wrong and he has nothing to do with this. Cindy said he was a great guy, but just kind of watching them interact, I felt like maybe he was controlling and she was kind of going along with it. I didn't know how involved she was or wasn't, but I always felt that she knew more than she was willing to at least tell me.
In March 2016, 4 months after the murder, detectives get a call from Richie's lawyer.
He said that Richie wanted to tell us exactly what happened. Detective Mattias and I went to the Ward County Sheriff's Department and asked that they have Richie Wilder brought up from the jail. His attorney was there.
Richie begins his statement by implicating Angela Wilder's fiancé.
He proceeds to tell the detectives this crazy outlandish story of how Christopher had somehow recruited him into a plot to get rid of Angela.
Chris said he kind of came up with an idea to, like, or I could get full custody of my kids and he could get full custody of his. He said he thought that she was cheating on him, you know?
So according to Richie, the night of November 13th at 2 a.m., a phone call comes in from Christopher Jackson.
He's like, I'm pretty sure I got his there. He's like, why don't you come down and get me? And then, you know, we'll head up and catch him in the act. So I was like, all right. So I just threw some clothes on real quick, you know, got in the car, drove to Walmart. We drove back to his house. We went in and we, you know, I just followed him. We went up some stairs and went through like a living room, the light on or whatever. And then he opened the bedroom door. It looked like there was two people in the bed. And of course, when we pulled out the cover, the first thing I noticed, there wasn't a person. That was a body pillow. But he grabbed her and he just started stabbing her. And he just kept stabbing her. And I was like, what the f*** are you doing, man? I ran over there.
He's in tears as he's explaining this. He said he went over there and checked for a pulse.
There was just blood everywhere. And like as I would touch her pulse, whatever, she like leaned up and like scratched the mess out of my face. I grabbed her hands. She was just like, I love you.
Detective Mattice and I were just letting Mr. Wilder talk and tell this story. He just kept digging his hole deeper and deeper.
Months after being arrested for the murder of his ex-wife, Angela Wilder, Richie calls a meeting with detectives and points the finger at Angela's fiancé, Christopher Jackson.
The detectives had just received a fresh batch of video surveillance footage from Walmart the night before they were scheduled to meet with Richie. And they had gone through every single minute, every single second of that video.
We were very comfortable and 100% sure that Mr. Jackson did not leave the Walmart.
When detectives confront Richie, he continues to stick to his new story.
What you're telling us does not fit. Because I know that Chris did not leave Walmart during the hours that you say that he did.
He did though.
I know he didn't because I watched it on video. I watched the minutes click by. I just watched that. But you're giving us details that indicate that you were there, and I think you killed him.
I didn't kill anybody.
I think you killed Angela.
I didn't.
Who did then? Because you were there.
Yeah, I told you Chris did.
You can't make it fit. It doesn't.
He looked at his attorney. His attorney said, you can stop talking at any time. And he said, I want to stop now. So then at that point, he knew that story wasn't going to get him out of this murder.
9 months later, in December of 2016, Richie Wilder's murder trial gets underway.
Richie was in the front with his lawyer and he looked professional, but he seemed to always have a smug look on his face.
The prosecution presents strong physical evidence, citing DNA evidence that ties Richie to the crime.
Angela's blood had been found in Cindy's car and Richie's DNA had been found underneath her fingernails. One of the things that the prosecution did have to kind of overcome is that the murder weapon had never been found.
After a 4-day trial, the jury reaches a verdict.
We felt that we were making the correct decision, deeming him guilty.
When I found out Richie was convicted, life without parole, I thought that was pretty awesome, actually.
I heard Cynthia crying in the back. She was so committed to her husband and how he was a good man and he wouldn't do this. Just almost like she had such a hatred as well for Angela. I always had a thought that she was involved somehow.
Cindy loved to get on camera and tell her sob story. There was several times she'd be crying and still expressing her support for her husband and claiming that he didn't do it.
None of it makes any sense to me at all. He's a good man. He's a good husband.
3 months later, detectives receive information that sheds light on the role Cindy played in Angela's murder.
In March of 2017, Matt Walters, a friend of Cindy Wilder's, told us about a Facebook conversation that he was having with Cindy Wilder, and she was making some admissions during that conversation that sounded like she was involved in the murder.
When did you first start talking to Cynthia through the Facebook messages?
She messaged me end of March this year. She started off saying a really leading comment about how the knife wasn't supposed to be the main plan. It was supposed to be a gun, that the knife was a backup.
Detectives ask Matt if he'd be willing to talk to Cindy again, this time while wearing a wire.
He was willing to let us wire his vehicle so he could drive around with Cindy and see if he could get her to make some admissions on her involvement in the murder of Angela Wilder. He made contact with Cindy Wilder, and they go out to a local bar, spent several hours there, and ended up driving home and sat in the driveway. And she began to talk about how they had planned this, how they worked together, planning the murder.
Are you mad at your husband?
No, like I'm proud of him. I'm just pissed that he got caught and that he got sloppy and impatient, and we like had this thing like planned for like 2 years.
Months after, Richie Wilder was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his ex-wife, Angela. Minot, North Dakota detectives are building their case against his current wife, Cindy, after she implicates herself in the murder plot.
Matt Walter's vehicle was wired, and Matt slowly got her to start talking about her involvement in the case. She was telling him that they were fighting over the kids all the time.
We had split custody, and I know like their mom just talked about me and Richie. Like I know that she would like call social services on Richie and I.
Cindy says that September 2013 they had a custody hearing, and afterwards she had said to Richie, "Wouldn't it just be easier if Angela was no longer in our lives?"
It's kind of fun just talking about it, just like that rush, and then next thing I know, it's like it's gonna go down tonight.
Detectives listen as Cindy tells Matt that on November 13th, she and Richie put their plan into action.
Like, she put up a good fight. Like, she did.
Well, I'm sure she's fighting for her life.
His face, like, and that's what got him too, was, like, if it was me, I would have gone back and cut her fingers off, I would have burned them, I would have lit the house on fire.
Do you think you're a horrible person, or do you think it needed to be done? Because now you've said both.
I fully believe that it needed to be done. Like, I helped him. We had this planned out. And he it up. Because he didn't clean the car good enough. One spot of blood in my car.
Cindy's taped confession is more than enough for prosecutors to charge her as a co-conspirator.
On May 19th, Detective Mattice and I went to Washington Elementary School, where Cindy Wilder was now currently working as a kindergarten teacher.
She did not say anything. Much like Richie, once she was arrested, there was nothing more that she was going to say.
In November of 2017, Cindy enters an Alford plea of conspiracy to commit murder.
She accepts the fact that the evidence that the state has against her is overwhelming and enough to convict her on this charge. So she pleads guilty without actually admitting any wrongdoing.
In May 2018, Cindy appears in the courtroom for sentencing.
Cynthia has an opportunity to plead with the court, basically, and tell her side of the story before the judge issues her ruling on punishment.
This is kind of an open plea, so that it's up to the judge what she wants to pose for a sentence. There was recordings replayed of Cindy saying that Angela's fingers should have been cut off and the house burned down.
And so Cindy kind of downplays a little bit the information that she had shared with Matt by saying that she was trying to brag. That didn't really go over very well, given the fact that not many people brag about a brutal murder.
The judge hit her with the strongest sentence she could give her, which was life without parole.
When I found out that Cindy was going to go to prison for life without parole, I understood it, but it's just super hard because I've lost a daughter. But do I think she deserved to be punished? Absolutely.
I don't think that apart, Richie or Cindy would have carried out this vicious murder. But I think that they fed off of each other quite well.
Love can make people do crazy things. Things that you don't think about consequences in the long run.
Well, isn't it said love makes people do crazy things? Yeah. But I don't see love in this. I don't see love at all. I see the love between Angela and Chris. That was love. Love does not murder.
I personally believe justice was served, and I would want Angela to be remembered as someone that had integrity, as someone that was kind and loving, as a good mother, and as someone to be looked up to.
The fear did not begin with a single murder. It began with uncertainty. In the summer of 1976, residents across Sacramento County, California, started changing the way they lived. Doors that had once remained unlocked were bolted before sunset. Neighborhood watch groups formed almost overnight. Hardware stores reported increased sales of deadbolts, window locks, and outdoor lighting. Parents insisted their children come home before dark. Newspapers carried new headlines almost every week, each one describing another home invaded under the cover of darkness. At first, investigators believed they were dealing with an unusually bold burglar. Then, the attacks escalated. A series of sexual assaults committed inside occupied homes transformed public concern into widespread fear. The unknown offender became known as the East Area Rapist, a name that reflected geography more than identity because at that point, investigators knew almost nothing about the man responsible. He left behind no name, no confirmed photograph, and no obvious motive beyond an apparent desire to dominate and terrorize his victims. Over the following years, that same offender would later be linked to murders across California and ultimately become known worldwide as the Golden State Killer. California during the mid-1970s was experiencing enormous social and economic change. Suburban communities east of Sacramento had expanded rapidly as families sought quieter neighborhoods away from the state's larger cities. Rancho Cordova, Carmichael, Citrus Heights, Orangevale, and surrounding communities attracted young couples, professionals, and military families looking for affordable homes and safe streets. These neighborhoods appeared ideal. Tree-lined roads, modest single-family houses, and growing schools created an image of stability. That sense of security proved fragile. Residents began reporting unusual nighttime activity. Fences were found open. Gates that had been closed the evening before stood ajar in the morning. Small objects disappeared from garages or patios. In some cases, nothing of value appeared to have been stolen at all. Investigators would later conclude that many of these incidents were likely acts of surveillance rather than conventional burglary. The offender appeared to study neighborhoods long before attacking, learning routines, identifying possible escape routes, and observing which homes offered both privacy and easy access. Early victims described remarkably similar patterns. The offender usually entered after dark, often through an unlocked window or by quietly forcing a point of entry with minimal damage. He demonstrated patience that distinguished him from ordinary burglars. Rather than rushing through a home searching for valuables, he sometimes remained inside for extended periods before confronting the occupants. Victims later recalled hearing noises they initially dismissed as ordinary creaks or movements outside. By the time they realized someone else was inside, escape was often impossible. The attacks were characterized by planning and control. The offender frequently used ligatures to restrain victims, threatened violence to enforce compliance, and created an atmosphere of overwhelming psychological intimidation. Although investigators eventually recognized recurring behavioral patterns, each new attack deepened the mystery because the offender continued to evade identification. Law enforcement agencies initially faced significant challenges coordinating information. Police departments and sheriff's offices maintained separate investigative files. Communication systems were limited by modern standards, and forensic science lacked many of the techniques that would later become routine. DNA profiling did not yet exist as an investigative tool. Detectives relied heavily on fingerprints, eyewitness testimony, physical evidence recovered from crime scenes, and painstaking interviews conducted over many months. Even when similarities between cases became apparent, proving that a single offender was responsible required careful comparison of evidence spread across multiple jurisdictions. Detectives gradually realized they were not pursuing isolated crimes, but a serial offender whose methods remained remarkably consistent despite changing locations. Victim accounts became one of the investigation's most valuable sources of information. Survivors described an offender whose voice could shift dramatically from calm to aggressive without warning. Some recalled him whispering to himself during attacks. Others remembered periods of unusual silence. Several victims believed he possessed detailed knowledge of neighborhood layouts, suggesting he had spent considerable time observing his targets beforehand. Investigators also noted that the offender often selected homes near open spaces, canals, bicycle paths, or undeveloped land, features that could facilitate rapid escape after an attack. These observations influenced patrol strategies, yet despite increased police presence, the offender repeatedly avoided capture. As media coverage intensified, public fascination and fear grew simultaneously. Newspapers printed maps showing clusters of attacks. Television stations interrupted regular programming with updates whenever another assault occurred. Community meetings attracted hundreds of anxious residents seeking practical advice from investigators. Police encouraged homeowners to improve lighting, trim vegetation around windows, secure sliding glass doors, and report suspicious behavior immediately. Neighborhood watch programs expanded throughout affected communities. While these measures increased awareness, they did not stop the attacks. Each new incident reinforced the unsettling possibility that the offender was adapting alongside investigators. One recurring feature complicated the investigation further. The offender appeared comfortable taking extraordinary risks. Unlike many burglars who avoided occupied homes, he deliberately entered residences while people slept inside. That willingness suggested confidence, planning, and familiarity with the environments he targeted. The detectives debated whether he possessed military training, law enforcement experience, or simply years of criminal practice. Various theories emerged, but none could be confirmed through available evidence. Composite sketches based on eyewitness descriptions varied, reflecting the inherent difficulty of identifying an intruder encountered under traumatic conditions and limited lighting. The investigation expanded as detectives collected physical evidence from multiple crime scenes. Shoe impressions, fingerprints, discarded items, and biological evidence were documented according to the forensic standards of the era. Although many of these materials could not be fully analyzed with 1970s technology, investigators preserved them carefully. That decision, routine in some respects and forward-looking in others, would prove extraordinarily significant decades later. At the time, however, the preserved evidence represented unanswered questions rather than immediate solutions. Public pressure mounted with every passing month. Editorials criticized the apparent inability of authorities to identify the offender. Rumors circulated freely. Innocent individuals occasionally found themselves the subject of suspicion based on little more than coincidence or neighborhood gossip. Detectives repeatedly emphasized the importance of evidence over speculation, cautioning that false accusations diverted valuable resources from the investigation. Even so, anxiety reshaped daily life. Families altered evening routines. Children were instructed never to answer doors after dark. Firearms sales reportedly increased in some communities as residents sought additional means of protection. The unknown offender's apparent mobility further complicated the search. Crimes occurred across different neighborhoods with no immediately obvious pattern beyond careful target selection. Detectives considered whether the offender lived locally, commuted through the area, or possessed employment that provided familiarity with residential developments. Every possibility required investigation. Thousands of tips reached law enforcement. Many appeared promising initially before collapsing under closer examination. Suspects were interviewed, alibis verified, fingerprints compared, and evidence reviewed repeatedly. None produced the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. Unknown to detectives and the public alike, the series of crimes that began in Sacramento represented only one chapter of a much larger criminal pattern. Years later, investigators would establish connections between assaults in Northern California and murders committed hundreds of miles away in Southern California. That realization fundamentally changed the historical understanding of the case, but during the late 1970s, those links had not yet been recognized. Investigators remained focused on stopping an offender who seemed capable of striking again without warning. The communities affected by these crimes entered a prolonged period defined by vigilance and uncertainty. Fear became part of ordinary conversation. Local newspapers no longer reported isolated incidents, but an evolving investigation whose outcome remained uncertain. Every unexplained noise after midnight, every unfamiliar vehicle parked along a residential street, and every report of suspicious activity carried new significance. Residents waited for answers that never seemed to arrive. Detectives continued collecting evidence, comparing reports, and following leads, believing that somewhere within thousands of pages of investigative files lay the key to identifying the unknown offender. At that moment in history, however, the man who would eventually become known around the world as the Golden State Killer remained exactly what investigators feared most: a serial offender who understood how to disappear into ordinary life while leaving behind an extraordinary trail of crime. By late 1976, investigators understood that they were confronting an offender whose methods reflected careful preparation rather than impulsive criminal behavior. Each new attack added to a growing body of evidence, allowing detectives to compare patterns across multiple crime scenes. Victims consistently described an intruder who appeared familiar with residential layouts, who often entered after extended periods of surveillance, and who exercised a high degree of control throughout the offenses. Detectives concluded that the offender likely spent considerable time observing neighborhoods before selecting a target. Reports from residents of prowlers, unexplained noises, or minor burglaries in the days or weeks preceding attacks became increasingly significant as investigators reviewed earlier case files. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Office devoted substantial resources to the investigation. Detectives conducted hundreds of interviews, revisited previous reports, and worked to identify recurring details that might distinguish the offender from other criminals active in Northern California. Officers distributed crime prevention information to neighborhoods believed to be at elevated risk, encouraging residents to secure windows and doors, improve exterior lighting, and promptly report suspicious activity. Neighborhood watch programs expanded rapidly, reflecting both growing public concern and a desire among residents to assist law enforcement in preventing further crimes. Despite these efforts, the offender continued to evade capture. One reason was the absence of investigative technologies that later became standard. DNA profiling had not yet been developed for criminal investigations, and forensic scientists relied primarily on fingerprints, footwear impressions, tool marks, blood typing, hair comparisons, and other forms of physical evidence available at the time. Biological evidence recovered from crime scenes could be preserved, but it could not yet reveal the identity of an unknown suspect. Investigators therefore focused heavily on witness testimony, behavioral analysis, and painstaking comparisons between individual cases. As the investigation expanded, detectives noted that the offender's apparent confidence distinguished him from many other serial offenders of the period. He repeatedly entered occupied homes at night despite the obvious risks. Such conduct suggested that he possessed considerable experience avoiding detection. Investigators debated whether he had military training, law enforcement knowledge, or employment that exposed him to residential neighborhoods on a regular basis. None of these theories could be confirmed through available evidence, but each influenced investigative strategies and suspect evaluations. Public interest intensified as local and regional media reported each new development. Newspapers published timelines of attacks and maps showing affected neighborhoods. Television news broadcasts interviewed law enforcement officials and crime prevention specialists. Community meetings often attracted hundreds of residents seeking practical advice and reassurance. Officials emphasized that while no preventive measure could guarantee safety, increased awareness and prompt reporting of suspicious activity remained essential. At the same time, investigators recognized the importance of avoiding unsupported speculation. Numerous tips identified possible suspects, but most were eliminated after interviews, fingerprint comparisons, or corroborated alibis. Detectives repeatedly reminded the public that resemblance to composite sketches or neighborhood rumors did not constitute evidence. The volume of information received from citizens demonstrated the level of community engagement, yet it also required investigators to devote significant resources to evaluating leads that ultimately proved unrelated. The offender's geographic mobility further complicated the investigation. Although many attacks occurred within relatively close proximity during the early stages, the overall pattern suggested that he could travel efficiently between communities. Detectives examined roadway access, bicycle paths, canals, and undeveloped areas that might facilitate discrete movement before and after offenses. Crime scene analyses indicated that the offender often selected neighborhoods offering multiple escape routes, making rapid pursuit difficult even when police responded quickly. Behavioral observations also became increasingly important. Detectives compared statements from survivors in an effort to identify recurring characteristics. Although individual recollections varied as expected in traumatic circumstances, certain similarities emerged regarding the offender's actions, methods of restraint, and apparent familiarity with his surroundings. Investigators consulted specialists in criminal behavior, recognizing that consistent patterns might reveal information about the offender's planning, experience, or future actions. These early behavioral assessments represented an evolving area of investigative practice during the 1970s. As months passed, the accumulation of evidence transformed what initially appeared to be a series of isolated incidents into one of California's most significant criminal investigations. Detectives maintained detailed records of physical evidence, witness statements, timelines, and geographic information. Although computers played only a limited role in law enforcement at the time, investigators developed increasingly sophisticated methods for organizing case files and comparing similarities across incidents. The sheer volume of information underscored both the complexity of the investigation and the determination of law enforcement agencies to identify the offender. Meanwhile, forensic laboratories carefully preserved biological evidence collected from multiple crime scenes. At the time, preservation served primarily to maintain the integrity of evidence for potential future examinations using existing techniques. No one involved in the investigation could know that advances in molecular biology would eventually transform those preserved samples into some of the most valuable evidence in the case. The decision to retain and properly document that material would later prove indispensable. The investigation also highlighted the challenges of coordinating information among multiple jurisdictions. As similar offenses were reported outside Sacramento County, detectives increasingly exchanged reports, forensic findings, and investigative observations with neighboring agencies. These collaborative efforts gradually improved communication, though limitations in record-sharing systems sometimes delayed recognition of broader patterns. Even so, investigators understood that effective cooperation would be essential if the offender continued to operate across county boundaries. For the communities affected, daily life changed in measurable ways. Security companies reported increased demand for alarm systems. Retailers noted higher sales of locks, outdoor lighting, and other home security products. Residents organized neighborhood patrols and exchanged information about suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar individuals. Schools, community organizations, and local governments incorporated crime prevention discussions into public meetings. While these responses reflected resilience and cooperation, they also illustrated the profound impact that a prolonged series of violent crimes could have on ordinary routines. Although investigators remained committed to identifying the offender, progress was often incremental rather than dramatic. Each interview, forensic examination, and crime scene analysis contributed another piece to an incomplete picture. Detectives recognized that solving such a case required patience, meticulous documentation, and continued collaboration rather than reliance on a single decisive clue. Unknown to them, many of the most significant breakthroughs would not occur for decades when scientific advances fundamentally altered the possibilities of criminal investigation. For the investigators working in the late 1970s, however, the task remained the same: preserve every piece of evidence, pursue every credible lead, and continue searching for an offender whose identity remained unknown, despite one of the largest investigations California had yet undertaken. As investigators accumulated additional case files through the late 1970s, They increasingly recognized that the offender's crimes demonstrated a remarkable degree of consistency despite occurring in different neighborhoods. Crime scene documentation revealed recurring methods of entry, patterns of movement inside residences, and evidence suggesting extensive pre-offense surveillance. Detectives reviewed reports of prowling, attempted burglaries, and suspicious activity occurring days or weeks before attacks, concluding that the offender often conducted reconnaissance before selecting a target. This realization shifted investigative priorities. Rather than focusing exclusively on completed offenses, law enforcement agencies began paying closer attention to reports that might indicate an offender preparing for future crimes. The growing investigation encouraged greater collaboration among agencies throughout California. Although modern statewide databases and integrated digital records did not yet exist, detectives exchanged reports through meetings, telephone conversations, written correspondence, and physical case files. Fingerprint records were compared whenever possible, while laboratories examined footwear impressions, tool marks, and trace evidence recovered from multiple locations. These efforts reflected an understanding that serial offenders frequently crossed jurisdictional boundaries, making cooperation essential even when administrative systems made information sharing relatively slow. At the same time, public awareness campaigns expanded considerably. Crime prevention officers visited community organizations, schools, and neighborhood associations to discuss practical security measures. Residents were encouraged to secure doors and windows, install exterior lighting, report suspicious vehicles, and maintain communication with neighbors. These recommendations were based not only on general crime prevention principles, but also on observations derived from the investigation itself. Detectives believed that increased vigilance could reduce opportunities for future offenses while generating additional information about suspicious behavior. The case also prompted renewed discussion about investigative techniques available during the period. Forensic science in the late 1970s relied heavily on careful evidence collection and preservation. Crime scene investigators photographed locations extensively, documented physical evidence, prepared detailed sketches, and maintained strict chains of custody. Biological samples, although not yet suitable for DNA profiling, were retained because they could still provide information through blood typing and other laboratory methods available at the time. Importantly, many investigators believed that future scientific developments might allow additional testing, a perspective that contributed to the careful preservation of evidence that would later become critical. Witness interviews remained another central component of the investigation. Detectives recognized that memories could evolve over time, particularly following traumatic experiences, so they carefully compared initial statements with subsequent interviews. Although eyewitness testimony alone could rarely identify an unknown offender conclusively, recurring observations from independent witnesses sometimes strengthened confidence in broader investigative conclusions. Composite sketches were revised as additional information became available, though investigators cautioned that such illustrations represented approximations rather than exact likenesses. As the number of offenses increased, behavioral specialists began examining the apparent decision-making process reflected in the crimes. Investigators observed that the offender appeared highly organized in many respects. He selected locations offering multiple approaches and exits, demonstrated familiarity with residential environments, and often minimized opportunities for immediate confrontation during entry. These characteristics suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous offending. Although behavioral analysis remained an emerging discipline, detectives considered these assessments useful when evaluating potential suspects and anticipating future patterns. Media coverage expanded beyond local newspapers as the investigation attracted statewide attention. Journalists reported on public meetings, law enforcement initiatives, and community responses, while generally withholding specific investigative details that authorities believed could compromise the case. This balance reflected the ongoing challenge of informing the public without revealing information known only to investigators and the offender. Detectives carefully distinguished between facts released for public awareness and evidence withheld for investigative purposes, recognizing that unreleased details could later assist in evaluating confessions or suspect statements. The prolonged nature of the investigation placed significant demands on law enforcement personnel. Detectives assigned to the case reviewed thousands of reports, interviewed numerous witnesses, and coordinated with prosecutors, forensic laboratories, patrol officers, and neighboring agencies. Major investigations often required reassignment of personnel and extended working hours, illustrating the substantial resources devoted to identifying the offender. Despite these efforts, Progress frequently consisted of eliminating possibilities rather than identifying the responsible individual. One important lesson emerging from the investigation involved the value of systematic record keeping. Detectives recognized that seemingly minor details recorded during one incident might later prove relevant when compared with evidence from another. Consequently, investigators emphasized comprehensive documentation of crime scenes, witness observations, timelines, and physical evidence. This meticulous approach would later enable investigators to revisit historical case files with greater confidence as new technologies became available. During this period, investigators also explored numerous potential suspects. Individuals were interviewed based on witness reports, criminal histories, geographic proximity, employment patterns, or other investigative leads. Fingerprints were collected where appropriate, alibis examined, and available evidence compared against known facts. While many inquiries initially appeared promising, none produced sufficient evidence to identify the offender. Detectives repeatedly stressed that investigative decisions would be guided by verifiable evidence rather than speculation or public pressure. The investigation likewise influenced broader discussions regarding serial crime within the United States. During the 1970s, law enforcement agencies increasingly recognized that offenders could commit related crimes across multiple jurisdictions over extended periods. Cases such as this highlighted the importance of interagency communication, standardized evidence collection, and centralized information sharing. Although many improvements would not be fully implemented until later decades, the experiences gained during investigations of this scale informed subsequent reforms in criminal investigation practices. Meanwhile, communities affected by the crimes continued adapting to a prolonged period of uncertainty. Neighborhood organizations strengthened communication networks, local governments expanded public safety initiatives, and residents incorporated additional security measures into everyday life. While these responses reflected resilience, they also underscored the lasting social impact of unresolved serial investigations. Public confidence depended not only on crime prevention efforts, but also on the belief that law enforcement remained committed to pursuing every available lead. From today's perspective, it is evident that investigators preserved evidence with exceptional care, despite the technological limitations of their era. Biological samples, documentation, photographs, and physical exhibits retained through decades of storage would ultimately become invaluable when forensic science advanced beyond what had been possible in the 1970s. At the time, however, those future capabilities remained unknown. Detectives continued their work using the best methods available, aware that each carefully documented detail might someday contribute to identifying the offender, even if the path toward that outcome remained uncertain. By the end of the 1970s, investigators faced an increasingly complex question. While the series of sexual assaults in Northern California had been extensively documented, reports of homicides in Southern California began to draw attention because of similarities that could not be easily dismissed. At first, the investigations remained separate. Different jurisdictions were responsible for different crimes, and the evidence available at the time did not conclusively establish that the same offender was involved. Detectives concentrated primarily on solving the crimes within their own counties, reflecting the practical realities of law enforcement before modern statewide databases and integrated digital record systems. As additional evidence accumulated, however, investigators noted recurring behavioral characteristics. Crime scene examinations suggested careful planning, nighttime entries into occupied residences, and an offender who appeared willing to travel considerable distances. Although individual cases differed in important respects, detectives increasingly questioned whether they might represent a broader pattern extending beyond a single region. These observations encouraged greater communication among agencies, even when definitive forensic links remained unavailable. The challenge of coordinating investigations across multiple jurisdictions was substantial. Each agency maintained its own case files, investigative priorities, and evidence management procedures. Detectives exchanged information through meetings, telephone conversations, written correspondence, and professional networks. These efforts required significant time and persistence, particularly because investigators often balanced major serial investigations alongside numerous other criminal cases. Even so, the willingness to compare evidence across county lines represented an important development in California policing during this period. Forensic laboratories continued examining evidence collected from numerous crime scenes. Analysts compared fingerprints, footwear impressions, tool marks, fibers, hairs, and biological samples using the scientific techniques available during the era. While many comparisons successfully excluded unrelated suspects, None produced a definitive identification of the offender. Importantly, laboratories maintained careful documentation of their findings and preserved evidence according to established procedures, ensuring that materials would remain available for future analysis as technology advanced. The investigation also highlighted the limitations of contemporary forensic science. Blood typing could classify biological evidence into broad groups, but it could not uniquely identify an individual. Hair comparison offered investigative value, but lacked the precision later associated with DNA profiling. Fingerprints remained one of the strongest forms of identification, yet investigators could only make comparisons against existing records. If an offender had never had usable fingerprints entered into law enforcement databases, identification became considerably more difficult. Throughout this period, detectives continued evaluating numerous suspects. Investigative leads originated from witness reports, anonymous tips, criminal histories, employment records, and geographic proximity to crime scenes. Each credible lead required systematic examination. Interviews were conducted, travel histories reviewed, fingerprints collected when appropriate, and available evidence compared against known facts. Most investigations ultimately eliminated the individuals concerned, illustrating both the thoroughness of the inquiry and the difficulty of identifying an offender whose crimes demonstrated considerable planning. Behavioral analysis also evolved as investigators accumulated more information. Specialists observed that the offender demonstrated patience, preparation, and an apparent willingness to alter methods when circumstances required. Rather than relying on a single predictable pattern, he appeared capable of adapting to different environments while maintaining certain consistent behaviors. These assessments did not identify a specific suspect, but they informed investigative thinking and contributed to a broader understanding of organized serial offending. Public attention remained high. Newspapers and television stations continued reporting significant developments while also covering advances in crime prevention and investigative practices. Community meetings frequently included discussions of residential security, emergency communication, and cooperation between citizens and law enforcement. Although public concern remained understandable, investigators consistently emphasized the importance of relying on verified information rather than speculation. Rumors circulated widely, particularly as the investigation extended over several years, but detectives cautioned that unsupported claims could hinder rather than assist the search for the offender. The prolonged investigation affected not only the communities involved, but also the investigators themselves. Detectives assigned to long-term serial cases often revisited evidence repeatedly, hoping that a previously overlooked detail might assume new significance when considered alongside later discoveries. This process demanded persistence and meticulous attention to documentation. Case files expanded into thousands of pages containing witness interviews, forensic reports, photographs, maps, timelines, and investigative memoranda. Maintaining these records proved essential because the investigation increasingly depended on the ability to compare information collected over many years. During this era, law enforcement agencies across the United States began recognizing the broader importance of coordinated approaches to serial crime investigations. Cases spanning multiple jurisdictions demonstrated that offenders did not necessarily operate within administrative boundaries. As a result, agencies gradually developed stronger professional relationships and more consistent procedures for sharing information. Although technological limitations remained significant, these organizational improvements laid the foundation for more effective collaboration in subsequent decades. One of the most consequential decisions made during the original investigation involved the preservation of biological evidence. At the time, investigators could not anticipate the emergence of DNA profiling as a practical forensic tool. Nevertheless, established evidence preservation procedures ensured that many samples remained intact for future examination. This foresight reflected professional standards, emphasizing the long-term value of physical evidence, even when immediate analytical capabilities were limited. Looking back, historians of criminal investigation frequently identify this case as one that illustrates both the strengths and the limitations of policing during the late 20th century. The detectives demonstrated remarkable persistence, carefully documented evidence, and pursued thousands of investigative leads despite technological constraints. Yet many of the scientific tools now considered routine, including forensic DNA profiling, national DNA databases, and investigative genetic genealogy, did not exist during the years when the crimes were first committed. Consequently, the investigation entered a prolonged period in which the available evidence was preserved but could not yet answer the central question of identity. By the early 1980s, many individual investigations remained officially active, even as the pace of new developments slowed. Detectives continued reviewing evidence whenever fresh information emerged, but the absence of decisive forensic technology limited the possibilities for immediate progress. Although public attention gradually shifted toward newer events, investigators understood that unresolved cases could still be solved if evidence was preserved and future scientific advances created opportunities that had previously been unimaginable. That belief would ultimately prove well-founded, though the breakthrough remained many years away. The investigation entered the 1980s carrying an extraordinary volume of evidence, but no confirmed suspect by this stage. Detectives across several California jurisdictions had accumulated thousands of pages of reports, crime scene photographs, forensic laboratory results, witness interviews, maps, and investigative memoranda. Individual cases had generated extensive documentation, yet establishing definitive connections among them remained a gradual process. Although investigators increasingly suspected that multiple offenses shared a common offender, confirming those relationships required careful comparison of evidence collected years apart and often by different agencies operating under different procedures. One of the most important developments during this period was the growing acceptance of centralized information sharing. Throughout the United States, law enforcement agencies recognized that serial offenders frequently cross city and county boundaries. California investigators became increasingly willing to compare evidence, investigative observations, and behavioral assessments with neighboring jurisdictions. While communication systems remained far less sophisticated than modern digital networks, regular professional contact helped investigators recognize similarities that might otherwise have remained isolated within individual case files. At the same time, forensic science was beginning to evolve. Laboratories refined methods for preserving biological evidence, documenting trace materials, and maintaining strict chains of custody. Although DNA profiling had not yet entered routine criminal investigations, scientists increasingly understood the importance of preserving evidence in conditions that would allow future re-examination. This emphasis on preservation reflected broader improvements in forensic practice and would later become one of the defining factors in the eventual resolution of numerous historical investigations. The emergence of behavioral analysis also influenced investigative thinking. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation expanded efforts to study patterns among repeat violent offenders. Investigators examined crime scene behavior, victim selection, geographic movement, and methods of operation to identify recurring characteristics that might assist ongoing investigations. These assessments were intended to complement, rather than replace, physical evidence. The detectives working California's serial crime investigations increasingly incorporated behavioral observations into planning and suspect evaluation while remaining aware that such analyses could not identify a perpetrator independently. Public attention fluctuated as years passed. During periods when no significant investigative developments became public, media coverage declined, and newer criminal cases occupied headlines. Nevertheless, affected communities continued to remember the investigation. Survivors, families, investigators, prosecutors, and local officials remained aware that the case had not been solved. For many, the absence of public developments did not indicate inactivity. Detectives periodically reviewed evidence, followed new leads, and reassessed earlier conclusions whenever additional information became available. The preservation of evidence required sustained institutional commitment. Physical exhibits collected during investigations often remained in secure storage for years or even decades. Biological samples, photographs, fingerprints, footwear impressions, and written documentation had to be carefully cataloged and protected against deterioration. Evidence management personnel played an essential role in ensuring that future investigators would be able to locate and examine materials collected long before advances in forensic science transformed their potential value. By the mid-1980s, a revolutionary scientific development began attracting attention within forensic laboratories: DNA analysis. Early applications demonstrated that genetic material could distinguish individuals with remarkable accuracy under appropriate laboratory conditions. Initially, the technique remained complex, expensive, and available only in limited circumstances. Many law enforcement agencies observed these developments with interest, recognizing that they might eventually influence criminal investigations involving preserved biological evidence. The first criminal applications of forensic DNA occurred during the second half of the 1980s. These early successes demonstrated that biological samples collected years earlier could, under suitable conditions, produce identifying genetic profiles. Although widespread implementation required additional technological development, investigators involved in unsolved serial cases began considering how preserved evidence might someday benefit from these advances. Cases that previously appeared unlikely to yield further forensic information acquired renewed investigative significance. During this period, investigators also reviewed unresolved case files using improved analytical methods. Advances in photography, mapping, and record organization allowed detectives to compare evidence more systematically than had been possible when individual offenses were first investigated. While these reviews did not immediately identify the offender, they reinforced confidence that preserved documentation remained sufficiently detailed to support future scientific examination. The investigation increasingly became an example discussed within law enforcement training. Detectives studying serial crime investigations examined the case to understand the importance of evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, and meticulous documentation. The investigation illustrated that even when immediate solutions proved elusive, professional investigative practices could preserve opportunities for future breakthroughs. Younger investigators entering the profession learned that unresolved cases were not necessarily unsolvable. Advances in science and technology might fundamentally alter investigative possibilities over time. Meanwhile, California's forensic laboratories continued expanding their capabilities. Improvements in analytical equipment, laboratory procedures, and quality assurance standards enhanced confidence in forensic results across a wide range of criminal investigations. DNA technology, although still developing, increasingly demonstrated its value in both identifying offenders and excluding innocent individuals. Prosecutors and investigators alike recognized that these scientific advances strengthened the reliability of criminal investigations by providing objective evidence capable of supporting or refuting investigative theories. By the early 1990s, DNA profiling had become an increasingly important component of criminal investigations throughout the United States. Jurisdictions gradually expanded laboratory capacity, developed standardized procedures, and established legal frameworks governing the collection and comparison of genetic evidence. Although many historical investigations had been initiated long before these capabilities existed, preserved biological evidence now offered new possibilities that investigators could scarcely have imagined when the crimes were originally committed. The California investigation remained among those benefiting from this scientific transformation. Detectives understood that previously collected biological evidence could now be examined using techniques unavailable during the original investigations. Laboratory analyses confirmed that multiple crime scenes shared the same unknown DNA profile, strengthening the conclusion that the offenses had been committed by a single offender. This represented a significant investigative achievement. Although investigators still lacked a name, they now possessed a scientifically reliable genetic profile that could be compared against future suspects and emerging DNA databases. Even with this breakthrough, identifying the individual responsible remained difficult. DNA databases were initially limited in size, containing profiles from only certain categories of offenders and crime scene evidence. A comparison could identify an offender only if the relevant DNA profile already existed within the database. In this investigation, repeated searches failed to produce a match. The unknown profile remained anonymous, demonstrating both the remarkable power and the practical limitations of forensic DNA during its early decades of use. Nevertheless, the investigation had entered a fundamentally new phase. For the first time, detectives possessed scientific evidence capable of uniquely identifying the offender if his DNA could eventually be obtained or matched through future technological developments. The investigation no longer depended solely upon witness recollections, behavioral analysis, or circumstantial evidence. Instead, preserved biological material collected years earlier had become the central investigative asset, ensuring that the case remained active despite the passage of time and offering renewed optimism that science might eventually accomplish what traditional investigative methods alone had been unable to achieve. During the 1990s, the investigation increasingly reflected a broader transformation taking place within forensic science. DNA profiling, once an experimental laboratory technique, became an established investigative tool throughout the United States. State and local crime laboratories expanded their capabilities, standardized testing procedures, and implemented quality assurance measures designed to ensure that genetic evidence could withstand judicial scrutiny. For investigators responsible for long unsolved cases, These developments represented new opportunities to examine preserved evidence using methods unavailable when the crimes had originally occurred. One of the most significant outcomes of these scientific advances was the confirmation that biological evidence collected from multiple crime scenes was associated with the same unidentified individual. This finding strengthened earlier investigative conclusions drawn from witness testimony, crime scene analysis, and behavioral similarities. While detectives had long suspected that the offenses were connected, DNA analysis provided an objective scientific basis for linking numerous cases across different jurisdictions. The unknown offender now possessed a single, consistent genetic profile that could be searched against emerging law enforcement databases. During this period, California expanded its participation in state and national DNA database initiatives. These systems were designed to compare genetic profiles obtained from convicted offenders and crime scenes, allowing investigators to identify suspects whose DNA had previously been entered into official records. As legislation evolved and additional samples were collected, the size and usefulness of these databases increased substantially. Investigators working historical cases regularly submitted unsolved crime scene profiles for comparison whenever database updates occurred. Despite these improvements, repeated searches failed to identify the individual responsible. This outcome illustrated an important limitation of forensic databases. A DNA profile could only generate an investigative lead if the corresponding individual had already been sampled under applicable laws. If the offender had never provided DNA to authorities, no direct match would be produced regardless of the quality of the crime scene evidence. Consequently, detectives continued exploring traditional investigative methods while recognizing that future scientific developments might create additional opportunities. Case reviews became increasingly systematic during the 1990s. Investigators revisited witness statements, reconstructed timelines, examined property records, and compared investigative findings accumulated over previous decades. Improvements in digital record management made it easier to organize extensive collections of documents that had originally existed only as paper files. Historical photographs were preserved through improved imaging techniques, while evidence inventories were updated to ensure that physical exhibits remained properly cataloged and accessible. The investigation also benefited from enhanced communication among agencies. Detectives from different jurisdictions participated in professional meetings, exchanged information regarding forensic developments, and discussed strategies for reviewing unresolved serial cases. The recognition that a single offender could commit crimes across multiple counties reinforced the importance of coordinated investigative efforts. Although administrative structures differed among agencies, cooperation continued improving throughout the decade. Academic researchers and forensic scientists likewise contributed to broader discussions surrounding cold case investigations. Studies emphasized the value of evidence preservation, comprehensive documentation, and periodic re-examination of historical files. Investigators increasingly adopted the principle that unresolved cases should not remain static. Instead, significant scientific or technological advances warranted renewed analysis even when previous investigative efforts had reached no definitive conclusion. The growth of computerized information systems further supported these reviews. Geographic mapping software allowed investigators to examine offense locations more efficiently, while searchable databases simplified comparison of reports collected years apart. Although these tools did not replace traditional investigative judgment, they enhanced the ability to identify patterns that might previously have required extensive manual review. Throughout the decade, public interest periodically returned as media organizations reported on advances in forensic science and their implications for historical investigations. Documentaries, newspaper features, and educational programs highlighted cases in which DNA evidence had identified offenders many years after crimes were committed. These reports reinforced public awareness that technological progress continued expanding the possibilities available to investigators. Families affected by unresolved cases often expressed cautious optimism that preserved evidence might eventually provide long-awaited answers. The legal system also adapted to scientific developments. Courts increasingly considered complex genetic evidence, establishing precedents governing laboratory procedures, expert testimony, and evidentiary standards. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike became more familiar with forensic DNA analysis, while laboratories adopted rigorous quality control measures designed to ensure the reliability of testing. These developments strengthened confidence in genetic evidence as an investigative and judicial resource. During this period, Investigators responsible for the California serial case remained committed to preserving every available avenue for future inquiry. Evidence storage facilities maintained biological samples under controlled conditions. Documentation continued to be updated whenever laboratory examinations or administrative reviews occurred. Detectives retiring from active service often transferred extensive institutional knowledge to successors, ensuring continuity despite the passage of time. This transfer of experience proved particularly valuable in investigations extending across multiple decades. By the close of the 1990s, the investigation occupied a unique position within American criminal justice history. It had become one of the country's most significant unresolved serial investigations, combining extensive physical evidence with decades of investigative work. Although the offender remained unidentified, advances in forensic science had fundamentally altered the nature of the inquiry. Investigators no longer relied solely upon eyewitness accounts or circumstantial evidence. Instead, they possessed a scientifically verified DNA profile capable of uniquely identifying the responsible individual if an appropriate comparison could someday be made. The beginning of the 21st century introduced further possibilities. Rapid improvements in genetic analysis, digital information management, and collaborative investigative practices continued expanding the tools available to law enforcement. Cold case units became more common within police departments and prosecutors' offices, reflecting growing recognition that historical investigations could benefit from modern scientific methods. Cases once considered unlikely to be solved increasingly returned to active review as new technologies demonstrated success in identifying offenders years or even decades after crimes had occurred. Although no immediate breakthrough emerged during this period, the investigation had reached an important stage. The careful preservation of evidence, sustained cooperation among agencies, and continued advances in forensic science ensured that the case remained viable despite the passage of more than 2 decades. Investigators understood that the essential question was no longer whether the available evidence possessed value, but whether future scientific innovation would provide the means to connect that evidence to a specific individual. History would ultimately demonstrate that this expectation was well-founded, though the decisive breakthrough still lay several years in the future. The first decade of the 21st century marked a significant turning point in the investigation of many long unsolved crimes across the United States. Advances in forensic science, digital evidence management, and interagency cooperation created opportunities that had not existed when many historical cases were first investigated. The California serial investigation was among those receiving renewed attention as detectives recognized that evidence preserved decades earlier could now be examined using increasingly sophisticated laboratory techniques. Cold case units became an important feature of many law enforcement agencies during this period. Unlike active investigations that often focused on recent offenses, these specialized teams were tasked with systematically reviewing historical case files. Investigators examined original reports, verified evidence inventories, reassessed witness statements, and identified opportunities for additional forensic testing. Rather than assuming that previous conclusions were definitive, cold case detectives approached investigations with the understanding that scientific progress could fundamentally change what historical evidence was capable of revealing. The California investigation benefited from this philosophy. Detectives carefully reviewed documentation accumulated over several decades, ensuring that biological evidence, photographs, fingerprints, and other physical exhibits remained properly preserved. Laboratory advances made it possible to obtain increasingly complete genetic profiles from evidence collected many years earlier. Improvements in DNA amplification techniques enhanced scientists' ability to analyze small or degraded biological samples while maintaining strict quality assurance standards. National and state DNA databases also continued expanding. Legislative changes increased the number of individuals whose DNA profiles could lawfully be collected and entered into official systems. Each expansion prompted investigators working unsolved cases to request additional database comparisons. Although these repeated searches continued to produce no direct match in the California investigation, they demonstrated the persistence with which detectives pursued every available scientific avenue. During the same period, forensic genealogy began emerging within academic and scientific communities. Researchers studying human ancestry recognized that genetic information could identify relationships among individuals who shared common ancestors. Commercial genealogy services encouraged members of the public to voluntarily submit DNA samples for family history research, creating large databases that helped users identify distant relatives. Initially, these services were intended primarily for genealogical purposes rather than criminal investigations. However, investigators and scientists gradually recognized that the same principles might eventually assist in identifying unknown individuals connected to historical cases. At the time, the practical application of forensic genetic genealogy to criminal investigations remained limited. Investigators closely monitored developments while recognizing that important legal, ethical, and technical questions required careful consideration. Discussions focused on issues such as privacy, informed consent, laboratory standards, and appropriate judicial oversight. These conversations would later influence the development of investigative protocols governing the responsible use of genealogy in criminal cases. Meanwhile, advances in digital technology transformed the management of historical investigations. Large collections of paper records were digitized, allowing investigators to search documents more efficiently than had previously been possible. Geographic information systems facilitated more detailed analyses of crime locations, while electronic evidence management systems improved the organization and accessibility of physical exhibits. Detectives who once relied upon filing cabinets and handwritten indexes increasingly incorporated digital tools into their investigative work. The investigation also attracted renewed scholarly attention. Criminologists, forensic scientists, and historians examined the case as an example of the evolving relationship between traditional detective work and emerging scientific methods. Academic publications emphasized the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining accurate documentation, and supporting long-term institutional memory within investigative agencies. The California investigation demonstrated that cases extending across multiple decades required not only scientific expertise, but also sustained organizational commitment. Public interest remained substantial. Books, documentaries, and news reports explored the broader history of serial crime investigations and the development of forensic science. While investigators continued protecting confidential information essential to the case, public awareness contributed to renewed discussion of unresolved investigations throughout the United States. Families associated with historical cases often expressed hope that continuing scientific progress would eventually produce answers that earlier generations of investigators had been unable to obtain. Investigators themselves frequently emphasized that solving historical cases depended upon persistence rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Major investigations typically advance through the accumulation of numerous carefully documented findings rather than a single decisive discovery. Each laboratory examination, evidence review, witness interview, or database comparison contributed additional information, even when immediate results proved inconclusive. This methodical approach reflected decades of professional experience and reinforced confidence that preserving evidence remained worthwhile regardless of the passage of time. As forensic laboratories improved their analytical capabilities, investigators periodically requested re-examinations of biological evidence using updated methods. Scientific techniques that had not existed when evidence was originally collected now allowed more detailed genetic analysis while preserving the integrity of samples. These improvements increased confidence in the accuracy and completeness of DNA profiles maintained within investigative files. Professional collaboration likewise continued expanding. Conferences, training programs, and forensic organizations encouraged investigators from different jurisdictions to exchange knowledge regarding cold case methodologies and emerging technologies. Lessons learned from one investigation frequently informed approaches adopted elsewhere. The California investigation became one of many historical cases illustrating how evidence collected decades earlier could retain significant investigative value when combined with modern scientific capabilities. By the early 2010s, investigators possessed an exceptionally well-documented case supported by preserved biological evidence and a verified DNA profile. Although conventional database searches had not identified the unknown offender, detectives remained aware that scientific innovation often progressed rapidly. New analytical methods occasionally transformed investigations that had previously reached apparent dead ends. Consequently, the case remained active rather than dormant, reflecting the belief that advances in genetics and forensic science continued creating possibilities unavailable to earlier generations of investigators. Looking back, this period represented an essential bridge between traditional investigative methods and the emerging era of forensic genetic genealogy. Detectives who had spent decades preserving evidence, documenting investigative findings, and maintaining interagency cooperation had ensured that the case remained scientifically viable. While the decisive identification had not yet occurred, the investigation had reached a point where future technological developments, rather than additional conventional investigative techniques, appeared most likely to provide the breakthrough. That assessment would soon prove accurate as a new investigative approach, one combining forensic DNA analysis with genealogical research, began reshaping the investigation of historical cold cases across the United States. The year 2018 marked one of the most consequential moments in the history of cold case investigations in the United States. For decades, investigators had relied primarily on conventional DNA database comparisons, a process that required an offender's genetic profile to already exist within law enforcement records. In this investigation, repeated database searches had failed to identify the unknown individual responsible for the linked crimes. The preserved DNA profile remained unmatched, despite years of advances in forensic science. A different investigative strategy was needed. That strategy emerged through the developing field of investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional forensic database searches, this method involved comparing crime scene DNA with profiles voluntarily submitted by individuals to certain public genealogy services for family history research, subject to the policies of those services and applicable legal requirements. Rather than seeking an exact match, genealogists searched for distant biological relatives who shared portions of DNA with the unknown individual. From there, extensive genealogical research was used to construct family trees spanning multiple generations. This process required collaboration among forensic scientists, genealogists, and experienced investigators. Investigative genetic genealogy did not replace conventional police work. Instead, it generated investigative leads that required independent verification. Family relationships identified through genealogy could include dozens or even hundreds of individuals. Detectives therefore combined genealogical information with traditional investigative methods such as reviewing historical records, comparing known locations, evaluating age and geographic factors, examining military or employment histories where relevant, and determining whether potential candidates could reasonably be associated with the documented timeline of the offenses. The California investigation became one of the earliest high-profile cases in which this methodology demonstrated its potential. Detectives worked with specialists to analyze the preserved DNA profile obtained from crime scene evidence. Genealogical analysis identified distant relatives rather than an immediate suspect. Building family trees required months of careful archival research using publicly available records, including birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, newspaper archives, and other historical documents. Each relationship had to be confirmed before investigators narrowed the list of possible individuals. As family trees expanded, investigators systematically eliminated people who could not fit the known characteristics established over decades of investigation. Age, biological sex, geographic history, and other objective criteria helped reduce the number of potential candidates. This process reflected the importance of integrating scientific findings with established investigative practices. Genealogy alone did not identify the responsible individual. Rather, it provided a structured framework within which detectives could focus their inquiries. Eventually, investigators identified a person of interest whose background warranted closer examination. Consistent with standard investigative practice, detectives sought to obtain a legally collected DNA sample suitable for comparison with the crime scene profile. Public reporting indicates that investigators conducted surveillance and recovered DNA from an item that had been discarded in a public place, followed by collection of a direct reference sample after further investigative steps. Laboratory analysis compared these samples with the preserved crime scene DNA using established forensic procedures. The laboratory findings demonstrated that the DNA profile from the individual under investigation matched the profile developed from the historical crime scene evidence. This represented the decisive scientific confirmation investigators had sought for decades. The preserved biological evidence, carefully maintained since the original investigations, had retained its evidentiary value across more than 40 years. The result also validated the meticulous evidence preservation practices followed by investigators and forensic personnel throughout the intervening decades. On April 24, 2018, authorities announced the arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer, in connection with the long unsolved investigation. The announcement received international attention because of both the historical significance of the case and the investigative method that had contributed to identifying the suspect. Law enforcement agencies emphasized that the arrest reflected decades of investigative work, careful preservation of evidence, advances in forensic science, and collaboration among numerous local, state, and federal partners. Following the arrest, prosecutors filed charges in multiple California jurisdictions. Because the investigation encompassed crimes committed over many years in different counties, coordination among prosecutors and law enforcement agencies became especially important. Investigators reviewed extensive historical case files to ensure that documentary evidence, witness statements, laboratory reports, and preserved exhibits remained available for judicial proceedings. Many retired detectives returned to assist with historical context and explain investigative decisions made decades earlier. The case also prompted widespread discussion regarding investigative genetic genealogy. Legal scholars, forensic scientists, ethicists, and policymakers examined the benefits and potential privacy implications of using publicly available genealogical information in criminal investigations. Professional organizations developed guidance addressing laboratory standards, investigative procedures, and appropriate oversight. The California investigation became a frequently cited example in these discussions because it demonstrated both the effectiveness of the method and the importance of establishing clear policies governing its use. From a forensic perspective, the investigation highlighted several enduring principles. First, careful evidence preservation can maintain the value of biological material for decades, even when contemporary technology cannot fully analyze it. Second, scientific advances often create opportunities that were impossible during the original investigation. Third, successful cold case investigations typically depend upon sustained cooperation among investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, genealogists, and evidence management personnel rather than a single technological innovation acting alone. The investigation also influenced cold case practices throughout the United States and internationally. Law enforcement agencies reviewed unsolved cases involving preserved biological evidence to determine whether investigative genetic genealogy might provide new leads. Numerous historical investigations were subsequently reopened using similar methodologies, although each required independent forensic confirmation and adherence to applicable legal standards. The California case demonstrated that scientific progress could fundamentally alter the prospects of investigations once considered unlikely to be resolved. By the time of the arrest, more than 4 decades had passed since the earliest crimes connected through the investigation. During those years, generations of detectives, forensic analysts, prosecutors, and evidence custodians had contributed to preserving the integrity of the case. Their cumulative work ensured that when appropriate scientific tools finally became available, investigators possessed both the evidence and the documentation necessary to establish a reliable identification. The arrest, therefore, represented not only the application of innovative forensic science, but also the culmination of decades of methodical investigative effort grounded in careful documentation, evidence preservation, and interagency cooperation. Following the arrest in April 2018, the investigation entered a new phase focused on preparing one of the most complex criminal prosecutions in California history. The case now required prosecutors and investigators from multiple counties to coordinate decades of evidence into a legally coherent framework. Crimes connected through forensic DNA and extensive investigative review had occurred across numerous jurisdictions over many years. Each county retained responsibility for offenses committed within its boundaries, making cooperation essential throughout the judicial process. Investigators immediately began reviewing historical case files in detail. Original reports, crime scene photographs, forensic laboratory records, witness statements, search warrants, and evidence inventories were re-examined to ensure that documentation remained complete and accessible. Because many investigations had begun in the 1970s and 1980s, some original detectives had retired. Several returned to assist prosecutors by explaining investigative procedures, evidence collection methods, and decisions made during the original inquiries. Their institutional knowledge proved valuable in understanding historical records prepared decades earlier. Forensic laboratories likewise conducted additional examinations where appropriate. Scientists reviewed historical documentation concerning biological evidence, laboratory analyses, and chain of custody records. Modern quality assurance standards required careful verification that evidence had been preserved, transported, and analyzed according to accepted procedures. The integrity of forensic documentation was particularly important because the investigation relied upon evidence collected over an exceptionally long period. The role of DNA evidence remained central. Prosecutors emphasized that genetic evidence linked the same unknown individual to multiple crime scenes, and that subsequent laboratory comparisons established a match with Joseph James DeAngelo's DNA. However, the prosecution did not rely exclusively on genetics. Investigators also presented historical evidence demonstrating similarities among offenses, witness observations, geographic patterns, and documentation accumulated during decades of investigative work. Together, these materials provided a comprehensive evidentiary record supporting the charges. Legal proceedings in a case of this scale involved extensive pretrial preparation. Prosecutors, defense counsel, forensic experts, investigators, and the courts addressed numerous procedural matters before any trial could begin. Questions concerning evidence management, witness availability, historical records, and scheduling required careful consideration. Because the investigation encompassed offenses committed across several counties, coordination among prosecutors was especially important to ensure consistency and efficiency. The case also highlighted the importance of evidence preservation over long periods. Biological samples collected decades earlier had remained scientifically useful because investigators and evidence custodians followed established preservation procedures. Similarly, written reports, photographs, and physical exhibits had been maintained in accordance with archival standards that allowed later investigators to reconstruct events accurately. Criminal justice professionals frequently cited the investigation as an illustration of why comprehensive documentation remains essential, even when immediate investigative progress appears unlikely. Public interest in the prosecution was substantial. Media organizations from around the world reported on court proceedings, forensic developments, and the history of the investigation. Law enforcement agencies balanced public transparency with the need to protect the integrity of judicial proceedings, releasing information through official statements while avoiding commentary that could affect ongoing litigation. This approach reflected established legal principles governing high-profile criminal prosecutions. The investigation also prompted renewed examination of cold case methodologies. Law enforcement agencies across the United States reviewed unresolved investigations involving preserved biological evidence to determine whether advances in forensic science or investigative genetic genealogy might provide new opportunities. Training programs incorporated lessons drawn from the California investigation, emphasizing systematic evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, and periodic reassessment of historical case files. Academic researchers likewise analyzed the case from legal, forensic, and historical perspectives. Publications discuss the evolution of DNA technology, the development of investigative genetic genealogy, and the institutional practices that enabled evidence collected during the 1970s to retain evidentiary value decades later. Scholars emphasized that scientific breakthroughs alone could not explain the outcome. Equally important were the original investigators' decisions to document crime scenes carefully, preserve biological evidence, and maintain detailed investigative records. Another significant aspect of the case involved the role of multidisciplinary collaboration. The investigation ultimately brought together detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, genealogists, evidence custodians, laboratory personnel, and legal specialists. Each discipline contributed expertise at different stages of the investigation. The successful integration of these efforts demonstrated the increasingly collaborative nature of modern criminal investigations, particularly those involving historical cases extending across multiple decades. The prosecution also reflected broader changes in criminal justice administration since the original investigations began. Advances in digital record management, forensic laboratory accreditation, DNA quality assurance, and statewide coordination all influenced how historical evidence was reviewed and presented. These institutional developments complemented scientific advances by ensuring that evidence remained reliable, traceable, and legally admissible despite its age. In June 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo entered guilty pleas to multiple counts associated with the investigation, including murders and kidnappings, while also admitting numerous related offenses as part of the legal proceedings. The plea agreement eliminated the need for an extended trial while allowing the court to establish an official judicial record based on the evidence gathered over decades. In August 2020, the court sentenced him to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. These proceedings concluded one of the longest-running serial crime investigations in California history through the criminal justice process rather than through a contested jury trial. From an institutional perspective, the conclusion of the case demonstrated how scientific innovation, when combined with careful investigative practice, can resolve historical investigations many years after the original offenses. The outcome did not result from a single discovery, but from decades of sustained work involving evidence preservation, forensic advancement, interagency cooperation, and continued commitment by investigators who believed that unresolved cases remained capable of being solved. The investigation, therefore, occupies an important place in the history of forensic science and criminal investigation, illustrating how developments across multiple disciplines can ultimately converge to resolve even the most enduring cold cases. The resolution of the Golden State Killer investigation extended far beyond the courtroom. Within law enforcement, the case quickly became one of the most influential examples of how advances in forensic science could transform the investigation of historical crimes. Agencies throughout the United States began reviewing unsolved cases involving preserved biological evidence to determine whether modern DNA analysis or investigative genetic genealogy might provide new investigative leads. While each case required independent legal and scientific evaluation, the successful application of these methods demonstrated that evidence collected decades earlier could retain significant value when combined with contemporary technology. One of the most important lessons drawn from the investigation concerned evidence preservation. During the original investigations in the 1970s and 1980s, detectives and forensic personnel carefully documented crime scenes, preserved biological samples, maintained chains of custody, and retained investigative records despite the absence of technology capable of fully analyzing all available evidence. Those routine professional practices ultimately became essential to the successful identification of the offender decades later. Criminal justice training programs frequently reference this principle, emphasizing that evidence should be preserved with future scientific advances in mind whenever feasible. The investigation also accelerated professional interest in investigative genetic genealogy. Following the public announcement of the arrest in 2018, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, legal scholars, and policymakers examined how genealogy could be incorporated responsibly into criminal investigations. Professional organizations developed recommendations addressing laboratory standards, documentation requirements, judicial oversight, privacy considerations, and criteria governing the use of publicly available genealogical data. Although jurisdictions adopted different policies, the California investigation significantly influenced national discussions regarding the appropriate role of genealogy in law enforcement. Another enduring contribution involved interagency cooperation. The investigation demonstrated that crimes committed across multiple counties and extending over several decades required sustained collaboration among local police departments, sheriff's offices, prosecutors, forensic laboratories, and federal partners. Information sharing, standardized documentation, and coordinated case management became increasingly important themes within law enforcement training. Agencies recognized that effective communication could substantially improve the investigation of serial offenses spanning multiple jurisdictions. Cold case units likewise expanded throughout the United States during the years following the investigation. Many agencies established specialized teams responsible for systematically reviewing unresolved cases in light of advances in forensic science. Rather than viewing historical investigations as permanently inactive, these units adopted the principle that significant technological developments warranted periodic re-examination of preserved evidence. Numerous jurisdictions reported renewed investigative activity involving cases that had remained unsolved for decades. Forensic science itself continued evolving after the investigation concluded. Improvements in DNA sequencing, laboratory automation, quality assurance procedures, and computational analysis increased both the efficiency and reliability of forensic examinations. Researchers also explored methods capable of recovering usable genetic information from increasingly small or degraded biological samples. While these developments benefited many areas of forensic practice, investigators consistently emphasized that scientific advances remained effective only when supported by careful evidence collection, documentation, and preservation during the original investigation. The case also influenced legal education. Prosecutors and defense attorneys examined the investigation as an example of how scientific evidence should be presented, interpreted, and evaluated within judicial proceedings. Cortez increasingly encountered cases involving complex forensic technologies, making expert testimony and laboratory documentation especially important. The Golden State Killer prosecution illustrated the necessity of maintaining comprehensive records capable of demonstrating the integrity of evidence across many years. Academic researchers examined the investigation from multiple perspectives beyond forensic science. Historians documented the evolution of investigative methods from traditional detective work to modern DNA analysis. Criminologists studied organizational cooperation among agencies. Legal scholars evaluated the implications of investigative genetic genealogy for criminal procedure and privacy law. Public policy specialists considered how technological innovation should be balanced with civil liberties. Together, these analyses position the case as a significant subject within the broader history of criminal justice. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of institutional continuity. Many original investigators retired long before the case reached its conclusion. Nevertheless, detailed documentation, preserved evidence, and effective case management allowed successive generations of detectives to continue the investigation without losing critical historical information. This continuity reflected the professional obligation of investigative agencies to maintain records capable of supporting future inquiries regardless of personnel changes. Training academies increasingly incorporated lessons from the investigation into curricula addressing major case management. Detectives were encouraged to document investigative decisions thoroughly, preserve evidence whenever practical, maintain organized case files, and remain receptive to emerging scientific methods. These lessons extended beyond homicide investigations and informed broader approaches to complex criminal inquiries involving long-term evidence preservation. Public awareness of forensic science also increased substantially following the resolution of the case. Media coverage explained how DNA analysis, genealogy, and traditional investigative work had contributed collectively to identifying the offender. Law enforcement officials repeatedly emphasized that technological innovation complemented rather than replaced conventional detective work. The investigation succeeded because decades of meticulous documentation, evidence preservation, witness interviews, and forensic analysis created a foundation upon which new scientific methods could build. Internationally, investigators and forensic scientists examined the case as a model for reviewing historical investigations involving preserved biological evidence. Agencies in several countries evaluated whether comparable methodologies might assist unresolved cases within their own jurisdictions, subject to national legal frameworks and privacy regulations. Although investigative genetic genealogy developed differently across legal systems, the broader principle remained consistent. Advances in science can significantly expand investigative possibilities when supported by carefully preserved evidence. Looking back, the Golden State Killer investigation occupies an important place in the history of criminal investigation because it illustrates the cumulative nature of scientific and investigative progress. The resolution did not depend upon a single technological breakthrough in isolation. Instead, it resulted from decades of evidence preservation, continual reassessment of historical investigations, improvements in forensic science, expanding interagency cooperation, and the eventual development of investigative genetic genealogy. Together, these elements transformed one of California's longest-running unsolved investigations into a landmark case that continues to influence forensic science, criminal investigation, and legal practice around the world. The resolution of the Golden State Killer investigation has become a widely studied case in forensic science, criminal justice, and law enforcement education because it demonstrates how multiple disciplines can contribute to solving a decades-old investigation. Rather than attributing the outcome to a single innovation, researchers generally describe it as the result of four interconnected elements: meticulous evidence preservation, advances in DNA technology, sustained interagency cooperation, and the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy. Each component depended upon the others, illustrating how long-term investigations often require cumulative progress rather than isolated breakthroughs. Evidence preservation remains the foundation of this process. During the original investigations, detectives and forensic specialists documented crime scenes using the best available practices of the time. Biological samples, photographs, fingerprints, laboratory reports, witness interviews, and physical exhibits were cataloged and retained according to established procedures. Many of these materials remained in secure evidence storage for decades before scientific advances made additional testing possible. Had those materials not been preserved properly, later forensic developments would have been of little practical value. Consequently, the case is frequently cited in forensic training as an example of why careful evidence management is essential, regardless of current technological limitations. DNA technology itself underwent remarkable development between the late 1980s and the early 21st century, Initial forensic DNA methods focused on comparing genetic profiles obtained from crime scenes with known reference samples. As laboratory techniques improved, scientists became capable of generating reliable DNA profiles from increasingly small or degraded biological samples. Simultaneously, quality assurance standards, accreditation programs, and standardized laboratory procedures strengthened confidence in forensic analyses. These institutional developments ensured that DNA evidence could be evaluated consistently within both investigative and judicial settings. The expansion of DNA databases represented another important development. State and national systems enabled investigators to compare unknown crime scene profiles against genetic profiles collected under applicable laws. Although these databases successfully identified numerous offenders, the Golden State Killer investigation also demonstrated their limitations. A database search could identify an individual only if that person's DNA had previously been entered into the system. In this investigation, repeated comparisons produced no direct match, illustrating that additional investigative approaches would ultimately be necessary. Investigative genetic genealogy addressed that challenge by introducing a fundamentally different analytical framework. Instead of seeking an exact match, genealogical methods examine distant biological relationships among individuals who had voluntarily submitted DNA for genealogical purposes, subject to the policies governing those services. Genealogists constructed extensive family trees using historical records such as census data, birth records, marriage records, obituaries, and publicly available archives. Investigators then combined genealogical findings with traditional police work to identify potential individuals whose backgrounds aligned with established investigative facts. Importantly, genealogy generated investigative leads rather than courtroom evidence. Any candidate identified through genealogy still required confirmation through conventional forensic DNA comparison. The investigation also illustrates the continuing importance of traditional detective work. Detectives reviewed historical reports, reconstructed timelines, examined geographic patterns, evaluated witness statements, and coordinated with prosecutors throughout the investigative process. These activities remained essential even after genealogical research identified potential candidates. Scientific methods narrowed possibilities, but investigators still verified evidence through established legal procedures before making an arrest. This combination of traditional investigative practice and modern forensic science has become a defining characteristic of contemporary cold case investigations. Interagency cooperation likewise played a central role throughout the investigation. Multiple California jurisdictions contributed evidence, investigative records, laboratory analyses, and prosecutorial expertise accumulated over several decades. Such cooperation required standardized documentation, effective communication, and long-term institutional commitment despite personnel changes. Many detectives involved in the original investigations had retired before the case concluded, yet comprehensive documentation allowed successive investigators to continue the inquiry effectively. Criminal justice professionals frequently identify this continuity as one of the investigation's greatest organizational strengths. The case has also influenced forensic education. Universities, police academies, forensic laboratories, and professional organizations regularly include the investigation in courses addressing DNA analysis, cold case methodology, evidence preservation, and criminal investigation. Students examine not only the scientific techniques involved, but also the administrative, legal, and ethical considerations associated with long-term investigations. This multidisciplinary approach reflects the reality that successful criminal investigations depend upon coordinated contributions from numerous professional fields. Legal scholars have examined the investigation as an example of how technological innovation interacts with constitutional protections and evidentiary standards. Discussions frequently address the appropriate use of investigative genetic genealogy, judicial oversight, privacy considerations, and laboratory reliability. Although legal frameworks continue evolving, the investigation has provided an important practical context for evaluating how emerging technologies should be incorporated into criminal investigations while respecting established legal principles. Beyond its scientific significance, the investigation contributed to broader public understanding of forensic science. Media coverage following the 2018 arrest and subsequent legal proceedings introduced many members of the public to concepts such as DNA profiling, evidence preservation, and investigative genetic genealogy. Law enforcement officials consistently emphasized that scientific breakthroughs did not diminish the importance of careful investigative work conducted decades earlier. Instead, they highlighted the cumulative nature of the investigation, in which each generation of detectives, forensic scientists, and prosecutors contributed essential work that ultimately supported the final outcome. The Golden State Killer investigation has since become one of the most frequently cited examples of successful cold case resolution in modern criminal justice literature. It demonstrates that long-term investigations can remain scientifically viable when evidence is preserved, documentation is maintained, and investigators remain willing to reassess historical cases as technology evolves. At the same time, it underscores that scientific advances alone are insufficient without the professional practices that ensure evidence remains available for future examination. Today, investigators reviewing historical cases often apply lessons derived from this investigation. Agencies routinely assess whether preserved biological evidence can benefit from updated laboratory techniques, whether historical documentation remains complete, and whether previously unavailable investigative tools may warrant renewed analysis. While each investigation presents unique circumstances, the broader principle remains consistent. Careful evidence preservation, sustained professional collaboration, and responsible application of evolving forensic science can significantly expand the possibilities for resolving historical criminal investigations many years after the original offenses occurred. The influence of the Golden State Killer investigation extended well beyond California and became part of a broader transformation in how law enforcement agencies approached unresolved criminal cases during the 21st century. Prior to the widespread use of forensic DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy, many cold cases depended largely on witness testimony, physical evidence that could be examined only with the technology available at the time, and traditional investigative techniques. While those methods remained fundamental, the rapid development of molecular biology, digital record management, and genealogical research created opportunities that significantly expanded the investigative toolkit available to detectives. One of the most immediate effects of the case was the renewed examination of historical evidence held by police agencies across the United States. Departments began conducting comprehensive inventories of unsolved cases involving preserved biological material to determine whether modern laboratory methods could produce additional information. In many jurisdictions, evidence collected decades earlier had been stored according to professional standards, allowing forensic scientists to revisit samples that previously yielded only limited results. This process required close cooperation among evidence custodians, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, and investigators responsible for historical case reviews. Cold case units increasingly adopted structured review procedures. Rather than waiting for new information to emerge spontaneously, investigators systematically reassessed unresolved investigations using updated forensic capabilities. Teams evaluated whether DNA testing had been completed under current scientific standards, whether additional biological evidence might exist, and whether advances in analytical methods justified further laboratory examination. These reviews reflected an important institutional change. Historical investigations were no longer viewed as static records, but as active files capable of benefiting from continuing scientific progress. The investigation also highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. Modern cold case investigations frequently involve professionals from multiple specialties, including detectives, forensic biologists, genealogists, prosecutors, digital evidence specialists, archivists, and crime analysts. Each discipline contributes expertise that complements the others. Genealogists may identify potential family relationships. Forensic laboratories verify biological evidence. Investigators examine historical records. And prosecutors assess evidentiary requirements for future legal proceedings. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated how coordinated efforts among these fields could produce results that none could achieve independently. Professional organizations responded by developing guidance for agencies considering the use of investigative genetic genealogy. Although legal frameworks differ across jurisdictions, many recommendations emphasize transparency, documentation, scientific validation, and appropriate oversight. Investigators are generally encouraged to treat genealogical findings as investigative leads rather than definitive evidence, requiring independent forensic confirmation before any enforcement action is taken. This distinction reinforces the continuing role of established forensic DNA comparison as the evidentiary standard within criminal investigations. Privacy considerations also became an important subject of public discussion. The use of voluntarily submitted genealogical information prompted legal scholars, ethicists, policymakers, and courts to examine questions regarding consent, data protection, and the appropriate balance between investigative interests and individual privacy. Some genealogy services modified their policies regarding law enforcement access, while legislative bodies and professional organizations considered additional safeguards governing future investigations. These discussions continue to evolve as forensic science and genetic technologies advance. Internationally, criminal justice agencies examined whether similar investigative approaches could be implemented within their own legal systems. Countries differ significantly in their laws governing DNA databases, privacy protections, genealogical research, and criminal procedure. Consequently, the adoption of investigative genetic genealogy has varied considerably. Nevertheless, the broader lessons regarding evidence preservation, interdisciplinary cooperation, and long-term case management have influenced investigative practices in many jurisdictions, regardless of the specific legal framework governing genetic research. The investigation also reinforced the value of maintaining institutional knowledge. Major investigations extending across several decades inevitably involve personnel changes as detectives retire and new investigators assume responsibility for historical cases. Comprehensive documentation, organized evidence management, and detailed investigative records ensure that successors can understand earlier decisions without relying solely on personal recollection. Law enforcement agencies increasingly recognize that preserving institutional continuity is as important as preserving physical evidence when managing long-term investigations. Technological advances beyond forensic genetics likewise contributed to improvements in cold case investigation. Digital imaging enhanced the preservation of historical photographs and documents. Geographic information systems supported more sophisticated spatial analysis. Electronic evidence management systems improved cataloging and retrieval of physical exhibits. Searchable digital archives simplified comparison of reports prepared years or even decades apart. Together, these technologies increased the efficiency with which investigators could review extensive historical records while maintaining appropriate evidentiary standards. Academic research has continued examining the investigation from historical and scientific perspectives. Publications in forensic science, criminology, legal studies, and public policy frequently reference the case when discussing the evolution of criminal investigation during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Researchers emphasize that successful cold case investigations depend not only on technological innovation, but also on organizational practices supporting evidence preservation, professional collaboration, and sustained investigative commitment over extended periods. The case has further influenced public expectations regarding unsolved investigations. Advances in forensic science have demonstrated that the passage of time does not necessarily prevent future investigative progress. At the same time, criminal justice professionals consistently caution that not every historical case contains preserved biological evidence suitable for modern analysis, nor can every investigation benefit from investigative genetic genealogy. The availability and quality of evidence, applicable legal standards, and scientific feasibility continue to determine whether particular investigative methods can be used effectively. Looking across the broader history of criminal investigation, the Golden State Killer case represents an important milestone in the integration of traditional detective work with emerging scientific disciplines. It illustrates how decades of careful documentation, evidence preservation, and professional cooperation created the conditions necessary for later scientific advances to succeed. Rather than replacing conventional investigative methods, modern forensic science expanded their effectiveness by providing new analytical capabilities that earlier generations of investigators could not have anticipated. This combination of institutional continuity, scientific progress, and collaborative investigation continues to shape contemporary approaches to cold case review and remains one of the investigation's most enduring contributions to criminal justice practice. By the conclusion of the criminal proceedings in 2020, the Golden State Killer investigation had become one of the most extensively documented cold case investigations in modern American criminal justice. Its significance extends beyond the identification and prosecution of a suspect. The investigation is now widely examined as a case study in evidence preservation, forensic innovation, interagency cooperation, and the long-term management of complex criminal investigations. Universities, police academies, forensic laboratories, and legal education programs frequently reference the case to illustrate how scientific and institutional developments can fundamentally alter the prospects of investigations that remain unresolved for decades. One of the investigation's most enduring contributions is its demonstration that criminal investigations are cumulative processes. The eventual outcome depended upon decisions made by hundreds of individuals over more than 40 years. Patrol officers responding to the original crime scenes, crime scene technicians documenting physical evidence, laboratory scientists preserving biological samples, detectives conducting witness interviews, prosecutors maintaining case records, evidence custodians overseeing long-term storage, and later generations of investigators reviewing historical files all contributed essential work. No single stage of the investigation alone was sufficient. Rather, each built upon the work completed by those who came before. The case also illustrates the evolution of forensic science across several decades. During the 1970s, investigators relied primarily on physical evidence, witness testimony, fingerprints, blood typing, and traditional investigative techniques. The introduction of forensic DNA analysis during the late 1980s and 1990s transformed many aspects of criminal investigation by enabling scientists to distinguish individuals through genetic evidence with unprecedented precision. Subsequent advances, including improved DNA amplification, expanded laboratory capabilities, computerized databases, and eventually investigative genetic genealogy, further increased the range of questions that forensic science could answer. Each technological advance expanded the value of evidence that had already been carefully preserved. From a legal perspective, the investigation reflects the adaptability of judicial systems in responding to scientific innovation. Cortez evaluated increasingly sophisticated forms of forensic evidence while maintaining established standards governing admissibility, expert testimony, and procedural fairness. Prosecutors and defense counsel likewise developed greater expertise in presenting and evaluating scientific evidence. As forensic methods evolved, legal institutions adapted to ensure that emerging technologies could be incorporated into criminal proceedings within established constitutional and evidentiary frameworks. The investigation further demonstrates the importance of institutional memory. Because the case extended across multiple decades, responsibility for the investigation passed through successive generations of detectives, prosecutors, forensic scientists, and administrators. Detailed documentation allowed later investigators to understand previous investigative decisions, locate preserved evidence, and continue inquiries without repeating earlier work unnecessarily. Modern law enforcement agencies increasingly recognize that thorough documentation serves not only immediate investigative needs, but also future investigators who may revisit cases years later under very different scientific circumstances. Professional standards regarding evidence management have likewise evolved in response to lessons drawn from investigations such as this one. Contemporary agencies emphasize comprehensive evidence inventories, digital tracking systems, secure storage, periodic audits, and detailed chain of custody documentation. These practices help ensure that evidence remains available and scientifically reliable regardless of how much time passes before additional testing becomes possible. The Golden State Killer investigation provides a practical example of why such procedures remain fundamental to effective criminal investigation. The case also influenced discussions regarding interdisciplinary collaboration. Modern cold case investigations increasingly involve experts from numerous fields, including forensic biology, genealogy, digital analysis, crime scene reconstruction, legal practice, archival management, and geographic information systems. Rather than operating independently, these specialists contribute complementary expertise within coordinated investigative teams. The successful integration of multiple disciplines has become one of the defining characteristics of contemporary historical investigations. At the same time, investigators emphasize that technological capability does not guarantee investigative success in every case. Many historical investigations lack preserved biological evidence, while others involve samples that have deteriorated beyond practical analysis. Legal restrictions, evidentiary limitations, or insufficient documentation may also prevent application of modern forensic techniques. Consequently, criminal justice professionals caution against assuming that every unresolved investigation can be solved through scientific advances alone. Each case must be evaluated individually based upon available evidence, applicable law, and scientific feasibility. Public interest in cold cases has likewise evolved following the investigation. Greater awareness of forensic science has encouraged renewed attention to unresolved historical investigations, while also increasing public understanding of the Complexity involved in criminal inquiries extending across many years. Law enforcement agencies frequently explain that successful cold case investigations depend upon patience, careful analysis, professional collaboration, and adherence to established legal procedures rather than dramatic investigative breakthroughs commonly portrayed in fictional media. The investigation has also become an important reference point in discussions concerning the responsible use of emerging technologies. Investigative genetic genealogy, in particular, continues to generate scholarly examination regarding privacy, consent, legal oversight, and scientific standards. Researchers generally distinguish between genealogy as an investigative tool for generating leads and forensic DNA comparison as the evidentiary process confirming identity. This distinction remains central to contemporary professional guidance governing the responsible application of genealogical research within criminal investigations. Looking across the broader history of criminal justice, the Golden State Killer investigation occupies a unique position because it spans multiple generations of investigative practice. It began during an era when forensic DNA did not exist, continued through the development of molecular genetics, expanded alongside digital information systems, and ultimately concluded using investigative methods unimaginable when the original crimes occurred. Few investigations illustrate so clearly the pace of scientific and institutional change within modern criminal justice. Today, the investigation continues to inform research, training, and professional practice throughout the forensic and legal communities. It demonstrates that preserving evidence, maintaining accurate records, supporting long-term institutional continuity, and remaining open to scientific innovation collectively strengthen the capacity of criminal justice systems to address historical investigations. While each future case will present distinct challenges, the broader principles demonstrated throughout this investigation, careful documentation, responsible scientific application, and sustained professional cooperation remain central to contemporary approaches for reviewing and investigating complex cold cases around the world. More than 4 decades separated the earliest crimes linked to the Golden State Killer investigation from the identification of the offender in 2018. During those years, criminal investigation underwent one of the most significant periods of scientific and technological change in its history. The investigation, therefore, serves not only as a record of a major criminal case, but also as a chronology of the evolution of modern forensic science. Few investigations have spanned such a broad period of institutional change while remaining active through successive generations of detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and evidence custodians. From a historical perspective, the investigation illustrates the importance of preserving evidence even when available technology cannot fully analyze it. Biological samples collected during the original investigations remained scientifically valuable because they had been documented, preserved, and stored according to professional standards. Those decisions, made decades before forensic DNA profiling became routine, ultimately allowed later investigators to apply technologies that did not exist when the evidence was first collected. This principle continues to influence evidence management policies throughout law enforcement agencies worldwide. The investigation also demonstrates how scientific progress rarely occurs through a single discovery. The eventual identification of the offender resulted from cumulative advances across multiple disciplines. Molecular biology provided increasingly reliable DNA analysis. Computing technology improved record management and data comparison. Laboratory accreditation strengthened confidence in forensic procedures. Genealogical research introduced new methods for identifying investigative leads. Digital archives simplified access to historical records. Organizational reforms improved communication among agencies. Together, these developments created investigative opportunities unavailable to earlier generations. Equally important was the continuity maintained by the criminal justice system over many years. Detectives retired, prosecutors changed, laboratories modernized, and investigative procedures evolved. Yet detailed documentation allowed new investigators to continue the work without losing essential historical information. This continuity depended upon careful record keeping, standardized evidence management, and institutional commitment rather than the efforts of any single individual. Long-term investigations frequently rely upon this ability to transfer knowledge across generations of professionals. The legal proceedings that followed the 2018 arrest likewise reflected decades of development within forensic law and criminal procedure. Scientific evidence was presented within established judicial frameworks requiring reliability, documentation, and appropriate expert testimony. Cortez evaluated complex forensic information while maintaining procedural safeguards fundamental to the criminal justice process. The successful prosecution therefore represented not only scientific achievement, but also the effective integration of modern forensic methods into established legal institutions. The broader impact of the investigation continues to be evident in contemporary policing. Cold case units across the United States and in other countries routinely evaluate historical investigations for opportunities to apply updated forensic techniques. Investigative genetic genealogy has been used in numerous additional cases, subject to legal requirements and professional standards. At the same time, agencies continue emphasizing that genealogy serves as an investigative lead generation method requiring independent forensic confirmation before legal action is taken. This distinction remains a central principle of responsible investigative practice. Research inspired by the investigation continues across multiple academic fields. Forensic scientists examine improvements in DNA recovery and analysis. Legal scholars explore the relationship between technological innovation and constitutional protections. Historians document the evolution of investigative methods over the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Criminologists analyze organizational cooperation among agencies managing complex serial investigations. Together, these studies ensure that the investigation remains an important reference point for understanding the development of modern criminal justice. The case also reinforces the value of multidisciplinary collaboration. Detectives, forensic biologists, genealogists, prosecutors, archivists, crime analysts, laboratory personnel, and evidence custodians each contributed specialized expertise during different phases of the investigation. Modern criminal investigations increasingly rely upon such collaboration, recognizing that complex cases often require knowledge extending beyond any single professional discipline. The Golden State Killer investigation illustrates how coordinated expertise can enhance investigative effectiveness while maintaining scientific and legal standards. Another enduring lesson concerns public expectations regarding unresolved investigations. Advances in forensic science have demonstrated that the passage of time does not necessarily eliminate the possibility of future investigative progress. However, professionals consistently caution that not every historical case can be resolved through modern technology. Successful outcomes depend upon the existence of preserved evidence, scientifically suitable material, comprehensive documentation, and investigative opportunities consistent with applicable law. Consequently, each historical investigation requires careful individual assessment rather than assumptions based upon previous successes. Internationally, the investigation has influenced discussions regarding forensic policy, evidence preservation, and cold case review procedures. Although legal frameworks differ among countries, many agencies have incorporated lessons concerning long-term evidence management, interagency cooperation, and periodic reassessment of unresolved investigations. The broader principles demonstrated by the case professional documentation, scientific rigor, and institutional continuity have proven relevant across diverse criminal justice systems. Today, the Golden State Killer investigation occupies a lasting place in the history of forensic science and criminal investigation. It is studied not because it represents a typical case, but because it demonstrates how decades of careful investigative work can intersect with scientific innovation to resolve an investigation once considered beyond the reach of available technology. Its legacy extends beyond a single prosecution, influencing evidence preservation practices, forensic education, laboratory procedures, legal scholarship, and the continuing development of cold case investigation. Ultimately, the historical significance of the case lies in what it reveals about the evolution of modern criminal justice. The investigation shows that successful long-term inquiries depend upon persistence, careful documentation, responsible scientific advancement, and cooperation across institutions and generations. It demonstrates that evidence preserved today may become more valuable as technology advances tomorrow, reinforcing a principle that now guides investigators around the world. While scientific methods continue to evolve, the foundations of effective criminal investigation remain meticulous documentation, rigorous evidence preservation, and sustained professional commitment.